I also wanted to share with you some work we've been doing on pre-coding. So I know some of you are interested in computer coding, and like, why would you ever do that in kindergarten? And so I'll just make a case. And this is where I'm getting at this idea of complex ideas with young children in playful contexts. So why coding? We're reading space, we're assessing distance, we're categorizing objects, we're chunking, we're thinking multiplicatively and additively. Like, there's so much going on in coding, it's crazy. We're recording and documenting, we're organizing and interpreting numbers and generating sequences to make things happen. And computer scientists and people like Papert, who started Logo, will say that coding is like the integration of all great math. Like, you're doing all kinds of mathematics at the same time when you're doing coding. But then we thought to ourselves, well, what does that look like with really young kids? And what might be fun to do there? So we decided to proceed with sort of an offline pre-coding series of activities in our classroom, based with K-2 children and teachers. And we identified a progression. Now, you heard a lot about trajectories yesterday. I know you're very interested. We look at those kinds of things as well in our research. And we also try to sequence lessons. Once we field tested them and the teachers have had the chance to see how the kids are doing, where they're at, and then how that builds. And so I'm going to show you a sequence that worked for a lot of children, very young children. So first we had to ask ourselves, one, what are some of the underlying spatial aspects and structures of coding? And the first structure that really hit us was grids, right? Like, the grid is a complicated thing, actually. And look at this grid. Do you see what we did? The students were having trouble finding the intersection. So we made windows. We made a row window and a column window. So if we know that we're looking for B2, or D2, I guess that is, D2, let's put a window on column 2 and another window on row D. Find that intersecting space and put our bingo chip down, or whatever it is. So we wanted to draw their attention to the intersecting space, and there's a reason for that. Because the research shows very clearly that when children are young, they don't actually get a grid. They see discrete spaces. And so they might sort of, instead of drawing a 9x9 grid like we would do, snap, they're actually drawing like 9 individual squares. So that's Batista's work, and Doug's work, and Jeff Barrett's work, and others. So rather than seeing like this grid as a continuum, right, of space, horizontally and vertically, they were seeing these individual squares. So that's why we did some of this. Okay. And then we wanted to introduce movement. So finding a place on a grid was part 1. Moving through the grid was the next thing we did. So here's what it looked like kindergarten.
Go down 3. Go to the right 1. Go up 2. Go to the right 1. Go down 1. Go
Watch,
to the
watch.
right 1. And rotate and go down.
Awesome. Can you believe it? So first of all, SK. But secondly, he knows left and right. They'd spent some time on this, and then I said, okay, show me what you figured out. So they'd been talking, he and his partner had been talking quite a bit, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 5, not sure. And then he started saying, okay, so you're going to go down 3, and then you're going to go to the right 1, and so on. But he got to the end, and darn it, wasn't the arrow pointing up in his hand, and the arrow was pointing down. We did that on purpose. We wanted to see what would happen. If he didn't bother turning it, he didn't pay attention to the orientation of the arrow. It's okay, he got to the place he needed to go to. But why not let him have that opportunity to demonstrate whether he did pay attention to the orientation. So we left it. We didn't scaffold it too much. We just said, let's just put it there and see what happens. And sure enough, at the end, he's like, darn it, what am I going to do? And so he rotated it. Pretty neat. Following a secret code was the next step. And you have a secret code on your table. So if you look there, you'll see like a grid. Maybe one has a code, a secret code already on it. And you might have some blanks. So what you would do is we would ask you to visualize first where you think the code is going without using a marker or anything. You'll see a starting point, and you'll see an end point, and you'll see a code. That's your secret code to get you along the way. What we would ask children to do is visualize that pathway first based on the code. That's a lot of memory work. That's a lot of thinking. They might trace with their finger, but we ask them to kind of like visualize it. And then they talk to their partner about what they see, and then they check it. So can you do one of those very quickly with your partner, please? So you could cut off the code and put it on a strip of paper somewhere. You know, if your grids are there in one place and you're using, I don't know, like laminated grid or something, and you've got your markers and you've got your strips, they can go and grab a strip. You could have them color-coded for scaffolding if you found some were easier and some were harder. All kinds of possibilities immediately to differentiate. And the children can make their own codes. So that's the secret code game. Dot is your starting point, check mark is your ending point, and you can make it as complex as you want. You can add more columns and rows. You can add all kinds of things to this. You'll notice there's no turns in this game, right? We're just navigating the grid, left, right, up, down. Okay, so here's some delight. So it's just this idea that they really loved it. And every time we've done this with kids, they just don't want to stop. They're absolutely beside themselves with excitement. It's like some kind of secret thing. They're not having to write anything, you know, words out or anything. They're just following this path. And then they love creating their own paths for other people to follow. The teachers found, and this is about when the language came into play, they didn't quite have enough about left, right, north, south, or whatever, you know. So they introduced barriers in the form of a photocopy box. But it doesn't matter, whatever your barrier is. We often use file folders or anything. And as soon as you put up that barrier, now you've got one child on one side, one child on the other side, and they have to tell the other person how to navigate using a secret code, and the other person can't see the code. So I have to say 2 to the north, or 2 up, and 2 to the right, and whatever it may be. And so it's that idea of when we really find sometimes that the language isn't coming along, we put a barrier in place, and it just pushes the language right up. So then we ask them to find different paths to different destinations. I'm looking at my time. I'm probably going to not be able to do this. But in this case, 2 children designed 2 pathways with the same start and stop point. Oh, I am okay. Okay. So they had the same start and stop point. And one of them, I'll just show you his path. It's just hilarious. 340. Okay. Look at the pathway. Do you see how long it is? It's like crazy long.
So we started there.
Okay, look how the teacher's chunking that.
So let Claire reach a call spot. You want to change so that part's done? Your start and finish. Oh, we're going to start on in the middle. Has she got it? Okay.
Okay.
Switch around.
So you can see there how the teacher's chunking it, because the boy made the pathway, and the girl in this group was quite hesitant. So she wanted to just scaffold a little bit. So every time a movement was had on the grid, then she pulled that up. But you see the cards? So the way this worked was, rather than having the kids write out their code, they could retrieve the information from a bin of numbers and directions and arrows. And that's important, because if it's about writing to versus retrieving to, we know retrieving to is easier, right? So we set that up so that they could pull the information from the sort of the card bin in order to do that. And so, you know, we weren't sure about how this girl was doing. And so we let it go, and then watch what happens. It's her turn.
Part's 5. So your job is very long. Code to get the chicken there a lot. Okay. CJ took you over there.
So watch her.
Okay. It is long.
So she's pulling a 2, and then she's pulling an arrow. You can hear that guy in the background. And pausing, thinking, visualizing. Teacher gives her the space to do that.
Okay, let's try. You want to check it again? Just to make sure. Or you're happy with your path?
Okay, she's done.
Are you happy with your path? Should we call CJ to check it? Okay, CJ.
That's the whole code that gets her to the same place in 2 moves, right? So she was thinking about it very differently. He wanted to have this long, winding path. She wanted this very efficient, short path. And we weren't sure she was understanding the game. So we really needed to give her the space to do that, you know? So then we asked them to assess the efficiency. What the shortest path versus the longest path, and which one would you rather take? And we thought they'd each pick their own path, but they both picked the most efficient path. They both said, let's just do this one with 2 codes, right? This is so much easier. So they were assessing efficiencies. That's a key part of coding, right? Efficiencies and elegance. So the next thing, there's the students. We had the next thing was really focusing on the students making their own codes. And this is when we inserted turns. So now the orientation of the person, the body, the object matters. So it's not just a grid, and we had good evidence. Remember that first video I showed you in this set, that some of them are really getting that idea anyway. So we started to insert the turns. And as we were inserting the turns, we also realized we wanted to insert the body. So the body's focus and orientation and movement came into play. You might think body would have come in sooner, but body is confusing in some cases because it's automatically orientation when we're facing front. We wanted to give them experiences with grids and sort of that top view with no orientation first, and then we moved it into the body, focused on orientation, like which way you're facing. You can see he's like, I'm going this way, right? He's like, I got my plan. It's like a full body movement in that direction. You'll notice he has a duck in his hands. We introduced ducks with a left and a right wing. So they were like, you know, navigating with their duck, left and right and stuff. So then we were able to move from their body away from, you know, so now it's just the duck. What would the duck be doing without necessarily being with the duck? So that is a long sequence that really helped to build a foundation. And then, of course, the students took off and the teachers took off. And you've seen this in Ontario all over the place, apps-based coding. That image there is from Lightbot. Great game for JKSK. You may know it already. If you don't, check it out. It's got immediate feedback. You know, you're walking in a certain direction, you have to turn your body, you have to jump, you have to do all these different things. And it's just sort of a bit of a wildfire, and we're pretty excited about that. There are other ones as well. You've probably seen Codable, and there's other apps you can get, but I particularly found Lightbot got at the mathematics, the coding part of things really well.